Video, I'm going to be going through different kinds of engineers, also known as engineering disciplines. And what we can see in this picture in the background is we have an image from the TV show Big Hero 6. And in this series, and there's a movie, there we can see 5 of the 6 main characters are all different. They all represent different fields of engineering. I'll talk about those more in a bit, but first we'll talk about, so Engineers Australia, they classify these different fields. They use the term engineering colleges, and it's interesting to note that sometimes these can be separate or sometimes they can be combined. So they refer to 9. I don't talk about management as a separate college in this video. That's something that they identify. But we'll go through them in alphabetical order. So we have biomedical engineers. They're concerned with medical problems. Chemical engineers worry about materials like plastics. They also are involved with the operation of nuclear reactors. And petrochemical engineers are interested in petrol and gas mining and other processing. Civil engineers and structural engineering being the other college that I don't separate out separately on this list. They're interested in big structures. There's also transport networks, so road and rail. Hydrology is to do with water, and geotechnical is to do with soil and rocks. And that's really important because we build everything else on top of the soil and rocks. And if we get the foundations wrong, everything on top of it can fall down. Electrical engineers make and distribute electricity. We also are interested, some universities have separate degrees for renewables. So PV is photovoltaics is solar power, whereas there's also wind and other renewable forms of electricity. Overhead wiring relates to trains. Environmental engineers protect the environment. ITE engineers, or Information, Telecommunications and Electronics engineers, they're interested in software, hardware, networks, and things like artificial intelligence. Mechanical engineers, they have subdisciplines of aeronautical, also aerospace. They both are involved with the air and space. Nautical engineering is to do with water, so that could be boats or docks. Mining is sometimes considered a separate discipline, so some universities have degrees that are just in mining. And mechatronics, most mechanical engineering is moving towards mechatronics because that's becoming an increasingly important part of mechanical engineering. But it's a combination of electrical, information, and mechanical engineering. And they are interested in robots and other automated processes. So to start off with, we'll go through those 5 big heroes. So we've got BAYMAX. BAYMAX is a biomedical robot. He is, I think, a healthcare companion, I think was the term in the movie. And he can diagnose problems and he can treat problems. So that's BAYMAX for biomedical. Honey Lemon is a chemist rather than a chemical engineer. And that's because she's working on new technologies rather than the implementation of existing technologies. WASABI is interested in electromagnetic fields, which is electrical and electronics. Gogo, she works on vehicles, so that would be mechanical engineering. Hero, he works on robots, so he's mechatronics. So biomedical engineers, they design and implement solutions to medical problems. This includes prosthetics, which is artificial limbs, like an artificial arm, organs, so like artificial hearts, and joints, like hip replacements. They also are interested in implants, things like the cochlear implant that help deaf people and people with hearing problems to hear better. They work on diagnosis, so things like scopes, everything from a stethoscope to an endoscope that goes up your rear end, scanners from x-rays to CTs to MRIs, and monitors like the ECG machines that measure your heart rate that go beep, beep, beep. Biomedical engineers are also interested in treatment and delivery methods. So treatments could be radiotherapy, where you shoot radiation at cancer to kill it, or delivery methods like insulin pumps to help people with diabetes. We have surgical techniques like laparoscopic surgery, also known as keyhole surgery, because that reduces the chance of problems with infection. It also means that you heal faster. And there's also assistive devices. So that could be anything from a cane or glasses to the sip and puff typewriter that helps quadriplegics to be able to communicate with the outside world. And these days, that would be things like self-driving wheelchairs or assistive robots like BAYMAX. Okay, so I could use other famous real-world engineers, but I find that it's more interesting for students when I talk about characters they may have seen in works of fiction. So I'll start off with Battle Angel Alita and the manga and anime Ghost in the Shell. And in both of these, we see a character who their entire body has been destroyed. All they have left is their brain, and their entire body is prosthetic. So they have sort of a cyborg suit that they get around in. Especially in Alita, though, we definitely see Alita's father, or her adopted father, as someone who works with prosthetics. He's helping out the people who lives in the town to replace the organs that have been damaged. In the Spider-Man series, Doc Ock is a nuclear engineer, but the prosthetic arms that he develops, they're controlled by his brain, so that they're very similar to Elon Musk's Neuralink, where people might be able to connect to the internet and control their computers from just their brain signals, and that's a big area of biomedical innovation at the moment. For chemical engineers, so we mentioned before that Honey Lemon is probably more of a chemist than a chemical engineer. The TV show that I've got in the background here is probably not really age appropriate for the audience I'm talking to, but it is a really good example of someone who is referred to as a chemist, but he's producing large amounts of chemicals. And when you're in production of large amounts of chemicals, that's really the role of a chemical engineer. And it's definitely possible that you could have a degree in science, a Bachelor of Science specializing in chemistry, and still become a chemical engineer, or the other. You can also go the other way around. So that's something to consider. So chemical engineers, they produce, store, transport, and use chemicals. This includes oil rigs, water treatment to make sure that our water is clean, refineries, tankers, and pipelines. In the movie Into the Spider-Verse, the best Spider-Man movie, Peter Parker, the one who sings the Christmas carols, he mentions that he has a degree in chemical engineering. Again, we see that it's surprising. We would think he'd be more of a chemist in what he does, in that he produces one-off uses of his web shooters, for instance. He's not producing large quantities in a factory. So it's more of a chemist than a chemical engineer. And that's most of the time he's referred to as a scientist rather than an engineer. Bruce Banner is also definitely a scientist rather than an engineer. He's not operating a nuclear reactor. He's someone who's doing research with nuclear technologies. But I thought I'd try and squeeze in the Hulk. Civil engineers, they design, construct, and manage structures and infrastructure. So structures include things like skyscrapers and stadiums. I think the plural is supposed to be stadia, but we're going with stadiums. And airports, they're big structures. So airports have things like runways and hangars and control towers. Infrastructure includes things like water supply, so the pipes that that give us our water, and bridges and roads and railways. That's all infrastructure. I always like to say that it's really important that when someone has a cancer treatment that they think of, oh, that doctor saved my life, or that surgery really improved my quality of life. Whereas we tend not to think about that with engineers, and I think particularly civil engineers, that if you try turning off your water supply for a couple of days, you'll very quickly appreciate the work that the engineers who ensure our, and plumbers, who ensure our water supply, how important they are to us. And the same thing for potholes and the making sure that we get reliable electricity and internet. Okay, so I have a couple of characters who are no way are engineers. So from the TV show Avatar, The Last Airbender, and this follow-up series, The Legend of Korra, TOPH is an earthbender, but she would be an amazing geotechnical engineer because she could tell you exactly what kind of soil or how deep the rock was whenever you were working on a large civil engineering project. She'd also be an excellent mining engineer. She's also my favorite character. Her daughter in the follow-up series in Korra, Suyin, she would be a structural engineer because she builds an entire city. The fact that the city moves would maybe make it mechanical, but we're going to focus on the structural part. Daddy Pig is probably the most famous civil engineer. He is maybe a materials specialist, but given that we see him doing testing in the real world, I'm going to say, and that we know that Daddy Pig loves concrete, he would probably be a civil engineer. Michael Scofield is from a very popular TV show about 15 years ago called Prison Break. And in this show, he gets a tattoo of the entire prison, and so that he can break out his brother from prison. And he's mentioned as a structural engineer. There's one of the longest books written in English is a book called Atlas Shrugged. And in that, the main character is, I think her name is pronounced Dagny, and she runs a railway, and she's friends with Hank, and he is a metallurgist, and he develops a new kind of metal. I asked a lot of people for suggestions, but when I was thinking about putting this together, and something that I heard a few people suggest was Minecraft Steve and Alex. They obviously do a lot of mining, so that's a field of engineering, and they build things, so that's probably civil engineering. EMMET is another suggestion I got. So construction is a really big part of civil engineering, that most engineers who go into civil engineering end up being construction site supervisors. But it's worth mentioning that's a consideration, even though EMMET is probably more shown as being more of a construction worker than an engineer. Very closely related to civil engineering, most environmental engineers usually have a background in civil engineering as well. Environmental engineers design and implement technologies and treatments that protect ecosystems and communities. This includes protecting national parks and things like that. It also means making sure that factories aren't polluting, and it also involves treating pollution. KATARA would be an amazing water engineer, but we see in one of the episodes that she's involved in removing pollution from a waterway, and so I didn't have many environmental engineers, so I thought I'd put KATARA in. ELLIOT Kynes is from the book, and there's an upcoming movie. It's like the third version of movie adaptation of the book Dune. And ELLIOT Kynes is the planetary ecologist, but it would probably be an environmental engineering role. So ITE engineers, they design, produce, implement software, hardware, and networks. This includes satellites and satellite dishes, programming, circuitry or hardware. They work on equipment. So trains, they control, they have traffic lights, which we call signals, and they have hardware that allows the train to go from one track to the other, that shifts and changes which track the train will run on, and that's called points motors. So that's all controlled by computers, and that's done by signaling engineers, and they usually have an ITE degree. Communication networks, things like the internet, and in Australia, the most famous example of that is the NBN, even though it has a pretty bad reputation. Neo and Trinity are probably the two most famous software engineers, at least in terms of box office sales. The movie The Matrix was a huge hit in about 2000. It's worth watching if you have never seen it before. The whole Matrix is probably also an aspect of civil software engineering. In the movie Contact, Ellie Arroway is an astrophysicist, but we see her working a lot with satellites and satellite dishes, so I thought I'd put that in for telecommunications because I couldn't really think of a better example. The movie Primer really focuses on two young electronics engineers, and they're working on a side project which ends up being pretty impressive. And it's the movie is on Netflix. It's a low budget movie, and it's a little bit complicated. You maybe have to watch it twice and maybe read the Wikipedia explanation in between. But I definitely think it's worth watching, and I recommend it. Naomi from The Expanse is a software and electronics engineer. BULMA is from Dragon Ball, and she develops a lot of, her father was the founder of Capsule Corp, and we see that she develops a lot of hardware solutions to help the team. Elliot from Mr. Robot is a software security expert, and that's a field that I keep reading online is set to triple in the next 10 years in terms of the demand in Australia. So definitely a growth area. Felicity from Archer is, the Wikipedia says that she has a degree in computer science, but what we see her doing is a software engineering role, and it's worth noting that, say, a lot of the people at Google who their business card says software engineer, they probably have degrees in computer science, And the difference between those things is a computer scientist is someone who develops new hardware or new software solutions, whereas a software engineer is someone who uses existing technologies to produce something like Google or YouTube or run databases and all the stuff that we see Felicity do in Archer. CYBORG is also, I think it says that he has a degree in software engineering online, but I mean, there's also a lot of biomedical stuff there. I'm not sure of the classification for this movie, but Ex Machina is all about artificial intelligence. I'm going to mention Tony Stark several times here, and because he fits into a lot of camps. To start off with, we're going to talk about Jarvis being an amazing example of software engineering and artificial intelligence. And we're going to move on to electrical engineers. They generate and supply electricity. They're concerned with generators, so making the electricity, transmitting the electricity, and substations control the voltage. And they also worry about making sure that trains and trams get the electricity that they need. So MIT, which is one of the most famous engineering universities in the world, if not the most famous engineering university, they claim Tony Stark as their most famous fictional graduate. And according to his bio on Wikipedia and elsewhere, Tony Stark has a double degree in physics and electrical engineering. And the arc reactor would be, if not the greatest engineering innovation, it would certainly be the greatest electrical innovation in 100 years since the development of the electrical generator. And that's because it provides clean electricity, very large amounts of clean electricity, which is really what we need in order to deal with climate change. Scott Lang, the new Ant-Man, they show in the movies that he has a degree in electrical engineering. He still can't get a job because of his criminal record. ASAMI from The Legend of Korra, we see her doing a lot of mechatronic stuff as well, and even mechanical stuff, but I'm going to include her as electrical because I think that's what we see the most of. Doc Brown always refers to himself as a scientist in Back to the Future, and he probably is because he's developing new technologies rather than implementing existing technology, but I'm going to put him down as electrical. So mechanical engineers, they design, produce, and operate machines. This includes making products, everything from lunchboxes and pens all the way up to cruise missiles. That's anything that's made in a factory is usually falls under the field of mechanical engineering. This also includes things like cruise liners, really massive, expensive things that would be done by nautical engineers, and expensive fighter planes would be aeronautical. The operation of mines is usually mechanical engineering, and the most expensive thing ever built, the ISS, the International Space Station, would also be something that would be worked on by mechanical engineers, or aerospace specifically. The Iron Man suit would be definitely the most important, if that was a real thing, would be the most impressive innovation in aeronautical engineering in 50, if not 100 years, if arguably ever. But Tinkerbell in the more recent, in the movies that came out in the 2000s, that we see that Tinkerbell is a Tinker Fairy, and initially not very happy about that until she saves the day. Bit of a spoiler there. Tinker Fairies are not mechanical engineers, but they're pretty close. Ben Gates from National Treasure, I've never seen these movies, but they mention that he's a mechanical engineer. There's a game called Oxygen Not Included, and I think this is a great representation of what it's like to be a mechanical engineer. So that's a game that you can get on Steam. In the movie The Martian, Mark Watney is a mechanical engineer and also a botanist. Both of those things are relevant because if you want to be an astronaut, you usually have to have two different fields. So you need to be an engineer and a doctor or something like that. In The Big Bang Theory, Howard is also a mechanical engineer who goes to space. In the TV show Firefly and the excellent movie Serenity, KAYLEE is in charge of keeping the ship afloat or in space, and she's definitely a mechanic. Whether or not she is a mechanical engineer, we see her solving a lot of mechanical problems, so it's good enough for me. Scotty is probably the most famous engineer. He's from the TV show Star Trek, and where in the later episodes we'll talk about later Star Treks, they would be more mechatronics because the computer becomes more and more important in the later Star Treks. Scotty is, I think, he would fall under mechanical engineering as his specialty. Mechatronics engineers combine mechanical, electrical, and software engineers. This includes robotics, self-driving cars, and artificial general intelligence, or AGI. I already mentioned Star Trek. They have to deal with the computer as well as the moving parts of the engine. In Star Wars, there's lots of robots built by, at least one of them built by Anakin. VARRICK is from The Legend of Korra. He does lots of stuff, but I'm going to put him down as mechatronics. And in the TV show Futurama, we see lots of robots, and those robots were all built by Mom's friendly robot company. Ultron in the comic books was originally designed by Henry Pym, the original Ant-Man. In the movies, they've changed that a bit, but he's a very smart and sophisticated robot, so that would be mechatronics. And Hero, who we mentioned at the top, but Hero is the protagonist of Big Hero 6, and he's all about robots, and I think that's a really big look at mechatronic, one of the aspects of mechatronics engineering. And that is my summary of different engineering disciplines.